Good morning. I'm so glad you could be with me today for more time in God's Word in the Unfolding the Word series. As you know, we're in the midst of a study of the book of Daniel. We're in the third chapter, and today I want to read verse 26 and 27. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace, and he declared, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here. And then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire. And the satraps and the prefects and the governors and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of these men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. As you remember, this third chapter has all been about the development of this great statue, which Nebuchadnezzar was doing in a response, a rebellious response to the dream of chapter 2. And in this great statue, which he turned all gold, in the image, his image was the head of the statue, he was calling together the people to worship that statue. And he put a death sentence on everyone who didn't do it, a death sentence of being thrown into the fiery furnaces. Of course, as the story unfolds, we discover that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego could not obey that command from the king. They were, in a sense, set up by the rest of the Magi order, who were refusing to accept the king's previous decision to put Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in leadership positions. The king calls for them to come before him. He quizzes them about their refusal to do this. He gives them another opportunity, and they refuse to do it. And in his anger, he made the furnace hotter, he bound them, and then he threw them into the fire, a fire now so hot that those who were involved in executing them were also killed by the heat and the flames. Yesterday, as we read the preceding verses, we discovered that God overruled. The king was astonished as he watched the events unfold. The hotter furnace and the bonds that he put on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were not sufficient to kill them. They could not overrule God's protective hand and God's purpose. In the same way, his statue would not overrule God's purpose and plan of history. So he stands astonished by it all. And yesterday we ended by examining this issue of the fourth man in the flames, that fourth man who made all the difference in the world. I shared with you why I believe that that was a reference to the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ. But whether it was or wasn't, the point was God had sent deliverance to them. Now, let's now continue on as we get to the end of this episode in chapter 3. As verse 26 makes plain to us, the king now addresses Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego very differently. In a way, the structures are made perhaps a little harder for you to see, but what's going on here is he is now requesting the three of them to come out of the fire. No longer is he the absolute monarch mandating and dictating and ordering things to be done. There's been a change of attitude. And now he requests that the three of them come out of the fire that he had just previously had them thrown into. He's perceiving them very differently. And one of the ways that we see that is, notice what he calls them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High. He doesn't say, my servants, my slaves. You're the three that I ripped away from your homeland in Israel, brought you back here, forced you into a training program. No. He says, servants of the Most High God, not my servants. What a very humbling response. And again, picture Nebuchadnezzar, a prideful man, a capable man. Perhaps one of the most capable of history, but prideful nonetheless. and such pride that he went through this whole episode of building this huge statue to attest that he could not and would not accept the inevitability of God's purpose and plan. Now humbly responding to these three. Speaking of humbling, one of the other things I want you to notice that's going on here, remember, this whole episode is unfolding while all of the core leadership of the empire are under mandate from the emperor to be there. Daniel wasn't there, still serving and carrying out some task that the king had assigned him. But all of the rest of the leadership of the empire from all the far reaches of the Babylonian Empire were there. And they were seeing everything that was unfolding. Remember in verse 27, the satraps, the prefects, the governors, the counselors, everybody, the clean sweep of people. God ensured that all of that leadership was there. The king had different reasons for ordering them there, but God had a reason behind the reason. What was that reason? Well, there's a great irony in all of this. These leaders at all of these places throughout the Babylonian Empire, these leaders would return to their homes, they would return to their service, their tasks in these various parts of the empire, reflecting on God's power, not the king's power. The intent of bringing them to Babylon was to get them to go back to their roles in the empire, reflecting on the king's greatness, the king's power, confident in the king's ability to dictate the future. Instead, they recognized the frailty, ultimately, of King Nebuchadnezzar and all human beings. They recognized the power of God, who overruled in a miraculous fashion the intentions of the king. The bottom line, of course, of all of that is that all of the time and energy and money that the king had poured into building this statue was wasted. It didn't promote him in any way at the most deep level of all of the leaders who made up the empire. God's word is filled with irony, and this is one of those examples. Now, finally, I want to point out to you today, and I want you to recognize that God worked a total miracle in this situation. The passage says, the hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks not harmed, though smell of fire had come upon them. Do you see the point? Nebuchadnezzar and everyone else was now looking at Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, who walked out of the fire free of everything. They saw that their bodies were not harmed. It wasn't like God's doing some first aid on third-degree burns. No. Their body wasn't harmed at all. More than that, that fire in that furnace was so hot it killed the mighty men that Nebuchadnezzar had used to throw them into this fiery death. Their hair wasn't even singed by the heat. You know how easy it is for hair, whether it's in your head, your arm, whatever, to get singed when you get close to flame. Their hair wasn't even singed. Their robes weren't even scorched, which means there was no sign of any being close to heat on the robes that they were wearing. In fact, the passage ends with this description. There was not even the smell of fire on them. It wasn't that they came out smelling like they'd been sitting around a campfire. No, they came out and there wasn't even any smell. Talk about total protection. That was what God did with them. But there was one thing that God permitted the fire to do. It took the bonds off of them. The only thing burned away was what Nebuchadnezzar had put on them to keep them from getting away. Once again, the irony of God. I don't want to end today without reminding you of a study that we have done in this together in Hebrews chapter 11. God uses this episode of saving people from the fire as one of the examples of the outcomes of faith. But as he does it in Hebrews 11, he reminds us that some were delivered in response to their faith from the flames. Others were turned to the flames. Not everyone, in response to faith in the Lord, is going to find the deliverance that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego discovered. The real issue is God's purpose, not his power. His power is sufficient to do the miracle that we see here and more. But what is his purpose? It's not always his purpose to deliver in that fashion. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego knew that. And even before their death sentence was implemented, they reminded the king that God may not choose to deliver us, but it's not because he doesn't have the power. And we're going to trust him and follow him in any case. Is that your approach to it today? I pray that it is. Well, join me tomorrow as we conclude our study of this third chapter of the book of Daniel, as we examine the broader response of King Nebuchadnezzar to all of these events. God bless.